The dust was a constant presence, coating everything in a fine, gritty film, the rough-hewn walls of the cabin, the sparse, sun-bleached furniture, the inside of Alara's mouth. It settled on her skin like a second hide, dry and weary. This land, vast and indifferent under an enormous, scorching sky, offered no comfort, only endurance. She had come here with hope, with a man who had promised a life built from the ground up, strong and enduring. But the promise had crumbled, like the dry earth beneath their feet, leaving her alone with the silence, the endless horizon, and the stoic, watchful presence of Finn. He had been there when she arrived, a man already weathered by the West, living on the edges, his reasons unspoken, his past a locked chest. They were strangers bound by necessity, by the shared ownership of this isolated claim left behind by her husband's sudden departure. There was no warmth between them, only a cautious truce, the air thick with unspoken judgment and mutual distrust. He worked the land with a quiet competence she couldn't deny, his movements economical, his gaze distant. She kept to herself, tending a meager garden, mending clothes, her days a monotonous cycle of survival. Her vulnerability was a raw wound, constantly exposed to the harsh elements and the even harsher reality of her abandonment. Fear was a cold stone in her gut, a constant companion in the suffocating loneliness. Every creak of the cabin, every distant sound carried the potential for danger. The land populated by shadows and whispers she didn't understand. Then the girl, small, injured, appearing like a mirage against the shimmering heat haze. She was Comanche, no older than 10, her leg broken, her eyes wide with a fear that mirrored Alara's own. Compassion, a feeling long buried under layers of despair, had surged forward. Against all her ingrained caution, against the silent disapproval she felt radiating from Finn, Alara had brought the girl inside. She cleaned the wound, splinted the leg as best she could, offered water and the scant food they had. The girl was silent, accepting, her gaze assessing. Finn had watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable, before returning to his work without comment. The girl's presence shifted the fragile dynamic in the cabin, adding a new layer of tension. Alara knew the risks. Tales of the Comanche were woven into the fabric of the West, tales of swift, brutal violence. But she could not turn a hurt child away. For 2 days, they sheltered the girl, a fragile secret held against the immense indifference of the plains. Alara felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, purpose, perhaps, or a desperate defiance of her own powerlessness. She saw a similar resilience in the girl's silent fortitude. The third morning dawned red and brutal. Alara woke not to the usual silence, but to a low murmur that prickled her skin. She moved to the small window, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Outside, spread across the rise like a dark, ominous wave, were warriors. Dozens, maybe 100, mounted on their ponies, silent and still, watching the cabin. Her breath hitched. They were here for the girl, and they were outside their door. The cold stone in her gut turned to ice. Panic flared, hot and sharp, threatening to consume Alara whole. Her first instinct was to cower, to shrink away from the terrifying spectacle outside the window. But then she saw Finn. He stood by the door, not braced for a fight, but waiting. His face was a mask of impassivity, his body language lacking the frantic tension that clawed at her. He was observant, assessing, his eyes fixed on the silent multitude on the rise. The Comanche girl stirred on her pallet near the fire, her eyes instantly snapping open, filled with a fear deeper than Alara had ever seen. She made no sound, but her small body tensed, ready to flee or fight despite her injury. Alara felt a tremor of respect for the child's courage. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk or the soft sifting of dust against the cabin walls. It was the silence of anticipation, charged with unspoken threat. Alara watched Finn trying to decipher his composure. Was it courage? Fatalism? Or did he possess some understanding, some knowledge of this land and its people that she utterly lacked? Their shared life until this moment had been marked by distance, by separate orbits within the small confines of the cabin and the claim. He was the capable, silent man who endured the sun and the labor. She was the bewildered woman left behind, clinging to the remnants of a broken dream. Now, the external threat had shattered the fragile boundary between them, forcing them into a shared fate. Finn shifted, a small movement that drew Elavis's attention. He unbolted the door slowly, deliberately, his eyes never leaving the warriors. He pushed it open, stepping out onto the small porch, leaving it ajar behind him. It was an act of extraordinary vulnerability, or perhaps profound confidence. Alara held her breath, watching from the shadowed interior. The heat of the day pressed down, the air shimmering between Finn and the waiting warriors. Still, no sound came from them, only that unnerving stillness. A lone rider detached himself from the group on the rise, moving forward at a measured pace. He was clearly a leader, his bearing proud, his face painted in fierce, bold patterns. He stopped several yards from the cabin, his gaze sweeping over Finn, then towards the dark opening of the doorway where Alara stood partially concealed. His eyes seemed to pierce the shadows, finding her. Alara felt exposed, her heart pounding against her ribs. Finn remained silent, waiting for the leader to speak. It was a test of wills, a silent parley conducted under the indifferent sky. The Comanche leader spoke finally, his voice deep and resonant, the words foreign but the intent clear. He wanted the girl. He gestured towards the cabin, his hand a sharp, demanding motion. Finn answered, his voice low, his tone neutral, not challenging but stating a fact. Alara couldn't understand the words, but she understood the gravity of the exchange. She glanced back at the girl, who was now watching the doorway, her small face a mask of quiet dread. Alara felt a surge of protectiveness, unexpected and fierce. This child, this stranger, had become a symbol, and her presence here had irrevocably altered their lives. The negotiation, if one could call this silent, tense exchange a negotiation, continued. Finn offered no resistance, yet he didn't immediately acquiesce. He seemed to be explaining, perhaps about the girl's injury, or perhaps about the circumstances under which they found her. Alara watched, her mind racing. They were outmatched completely. Violence seemed inevitable, yet Finn stood there, holding the space between their vulnerable cabin and the overwhelming force outside. It was a courage born not of recklessness, but of a deep, perhaps weary, understanding of the way things were. And watching him, a sliver of hope, thin and fragile, began to pierce through Alara's fear. She realized she wasn't just a passive observer. Her presence here, sheltering the girl, had put them in this position. Her path forward would require more than just surviving. It would require a different kind of strength. The Comanche leader listened, his face unreadable. Finn spoke again, gesturing towards the cabin, then holding up a hand, palm outward, in a gesture that seemed to convey explanation or request, not defiance. Alara could only guess at the nuances of their exchange, carried on the hot, dry air. Her focus remained fixed on Finn, on the subtle shifts in his posture, the way his gaze held the leaders. He was a man of few words, his presence usually defined by his labor and his silence, a figure on the periphery of her solitary existence. Now he was centered, bearing the weight of the confrontation. He was not the source of her fear, but a shield against it. This realization was quiet but profound. It chipped away at the wall of distrust she had built around him. The leader replied, sharper this time, a note of impatience entering his voice. He pointed again at the cabin, then made a series of quick, precise hand gestures. Alara could feel the tension coil tighter, the air growing heavy with unspoken possibilities. Finn responded, his tone still level, but his stance seemed to harden almost imperceptibly. He turned his head slightly, glancing back at the doorway, a quick, assessing look that included Alara and, she knew, the girl hidden inside. It wasn't a look of command or expectation, but a shared acknowledgement of the situation. A silent question hanging in the air? What do we do now? In that moment, Alara felt a shift within her. The overwhelming fear didn't vanish, but something else rose to meet it, a stubborn refusal to be swept away, to let her fate be decided solely by others. She had been passive for too long, defined by loss and abandonment. Now, facing a clear and present danger, she found a core of defiance she hadn't known she possessed. Stepping forward, she moved to stand beside Finn in the doorway. The heat outside felt like a physical blow, the glare off the dry earth blinding. The Comanche leader's eyes snapped to her, his gaze sharp and questioning. She stood straight, meeting his stare, not with aggression, but with quiet resolve. She was not just a woman hiding. She was the one who had offered shelter. Finn didn't react to her sudden presence beside him, didn't speak or push her back inside. His silence was acceptance, a tacit acknowledgement of her place in this stand. Alara spoke then, her voice trembling slightly but clear in the stillness. She didn't know the Comanche tongue, but she spoke to the leader as if he understood, using simple words and gestures. She spoke of the girl's injury, of finding her alone and hurt, of the simple act of caring for her. She gestured towards the girl, still hidden in the shadows of the cabin but visible if he looked closely. It was a plea, not for mercy, but for understanding, appealing to a shared humanity she hoped existed beneath the war paint and the threat. The leader watched her, his expression unreadable. He listened, perhaps to the tone of her voice, the sincerity in her eyes, the quiet dignity in her bearing. The moments that followed stretched into an eternity. The leader remained silent, his gaze shifting between Alara, Finn, and the cabin. The warriors behind him remained motionless, a silent, waiting jury. The sun climbed higher, beating down relentlessly. Alara stood her ground, her fear now mixed with a strange calm. She had faced the threat, not by hiding, but by stepping into the light, by speaking her truth. Whatever happened next, she had acted. Finally, the leader turned his horse slightly. He spoke a few sharp words to Finn, then turned his gaze back to Alara, inclining his head ever so slightly before turning and riding back towards his warriors. He said something to them, too low for Alara to hear, and then, as one, the contingent turned their horses and began to move away, disappearing back over the rise as silently as they had appeared. The silence returned, but it was a different silence now. The air hummed with the receding tension, the aftermath of a storm that had threatened but not broken. Alara stood on the porch, watching the dust trail disappear against the horizon. Her legs were shaking, and her heart still pounded, but the ice in her gut had melted, replaced by a weary relief and a strange, nascent sense of strength. She had faced down 100 warriors with nothing but her voice and her truth, and she had not faltered. She turned, stepping back into the cabin. The girl was watching her, her eyes no longer filled with sheer terror, but with a quiet gratitude. Finn was closing and bolting the door, his movements as deliberate and economical as ever. He turned to her, his gaze meeting hers. For the first time, she saw not just the stoic stranger, but the man who had stood beside her, who had held the line. There was no overt acknowledgement of what had passed, no words of praise or relief. But in the brief meeting of their eyes, there was a shared understanding, a connection forged in the crucible of shared danger. The fragile truce between them had been tested and had held, not just because of Finn's capability, but because of Alara's unexpected resolve. She knew the girl would have to go back to her people eventually, when her leg healed. But for now, the cabin, this small, isolated space, felt like a true sanctuary, defended not just by its walls, but by the resilience of those within it. Alara looked around the humble interior, at the dust, the sparse furniture, the pallet where the girl lay. It was not the life she had imagined, not the home promised to her. It was harder, harsher, marked by loss and fear. But in the face of true peril, she had found a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She was not just a woman left behind. She was a survivor. The future was uncertain, the land still vast and dangerous, but she faced it now with a quiet dignity and a partner forged in crisis. The dust might still settle on everything, but her spirit, tested and tempered, felt clean and strong. The sun still beat down, but the endless horizon no longer felt empty. It felt like a challenge she was ready to meet.